All right, so hello once again. Welcome to Android Design in Action. For those of you who aren't watching live and who are watching the YouTube pre-roll or the YouTube recording, we had some interesting technical difficulties. So we're just going to start over, and this will hopefully be the better version of the show episode. My name is Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, my name is Adam Koch.
And today we're going to be talking about we're going to actually show a demo of the I/O app. We'll talk a little bit about what that is in a second. We'll also talk about, we'll do a deep dive, and a narrow dive, as you pointed out before, into sharing as well as full screen UIs. So we have a lot of content to cover. This may run a little longer than 30 minutes. If it does, then really sorry about that, but too bad. So let's jump into the I/O app real quick. So the I/O app is an app that our team developed that helped Google I/O 2013 attendees I guess find their way around the conference, take a look at what interesting sessions are playing, as well as interact with folks socially on Google+. And obviously it is a responsibly designed app. There's a phone, tablet version. It supports 7-inch, 10-inch. Things kind of scale up progressively. So it's overall a quite nice app, and I guess we're going to do a deep dive on some of the details. Anything you want to add before we jump in?
I think something we mentioned on the previous run was that it's an open source app. So right now the source code that's out there is the 2012 version, so last year's version. But later this year, or hopefully in the coming months, we will be open sourcing the 2013 version as well.
Yes. Okay. So let's jump into the demo, and let's hope this it works this time. So here's the app running on 10-inch and 7-inch devices.
4-inch.
Oh, I said that wrong the first time too.
No,
okay, so 4-inch and 10-inch devices. You'll notice that there are a lot of similarities in the visual language. We'll talk about that in a second. But also, just in terms of navigation, on the phone you have tabs representing your 3 top-level sections. You have your schedule, which is personalized, your Explore, as well as your Stream. And Explore contains things like map and list of tracks and things like that. And then on a tablet, we blow it up into a kind of like a dashboard UI. Not actually the dashboard pattern with like a 4 or 6-pack of icons, but it's really kind of like a what's happening now type of screen, where you see your current schedule, upcoming sessions, as well as the stream of what are people buzzing about, what are people talking about on Google Plus about the conference. So it's kind of interesting. There are a lot of touches that we added to this app over previous years, and we'll do a deep dive on that now. So the first thing I wanted to call out was just the diagonal patterns that we use throughout. And this is something that has been around in Android for a while. More recently with like the Google Play Store as well as Google Play apps redesigns. We've kind of moved away from that, but we kind of held on to this pattern in our app. So what I'm really talking about here is this kind of diagonal line pattern that you can see here in the tabs. It may not come out well in the video feed. As well as over here in the schedule time heading. And the same goes for, on a tablet, the background actually of this area is that diagonal line pattern. So it's just part of the visual language of the app, and we use it throughout as kind of like a way to partly communicate or partly introduce contrast rather than using different colors, but also just as a kind of a visual stylistic choice. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was in the schedule, we actually have these borderless buttons, these secondary touch targets. And this is something that is kind of cool if you have a common other action for a line item. So here, rather than just choosing this session that's in my schedule, I can just choose to see all items that are in my schedule, or for that time, or all items in all available sessions in that time. Another one of my favorites is the contextual action bar. So let's say you wanted to share something immediately rather than jumping into the session. You could long press, and you actually get the contextual actions that you can take on there. You can also switch to other sessions, and you can't actually select anything else since you can't really do actions on them. Let's see. So moving on to the Explore tab. This is actually something that's fairly subtle. A lot of you that have used the app may not have noticed this. So we have this map area at the top, and something that we do is on press, we actually desaturate the background. So you can see that these yellow road lines, they actually become gray. Another app that does this, I believe, is Google Currents. One of the reasons that we decided to do it, and this is just kind of like a neat trick, it doesn't really add too much here, but it's something that helps prevent kind of color collisions between your touch highlight, your kind of like semi-transparent blue touch highlight, as well as, or collisions between that and the background contents. We also do this in other areas, I think, for avatar icons, which we can show later. And then obviously we're using different weights of Roboto. Here in the tracks list, we use Roboto Lite. And actually, for sessions that have passed, you can't really see this here because it's after the conference, but during the conference, past sessions were actually typeset in Roboto Lite to give them a little less visual weight so that your eye can naturally kind of focus on things that are yet to come. Another item in the visual language is we use these kind of circle masks. And we do this throughout. We use these in the stream here. So you'll notice that here in the stream, each poster, each Google Plus person that's posted something is in a circle. And this actually is shown as well on a phone if you jump into, say, like the track details. So you'll see that at the top left, we use this kind of track icon that's inside of a circle. And the reason for using circles, I mean, just as a general stylistic choice, is, I mean, it's almost like a cleaner visual. It's a little more light. Having a lot of boxes and squares can kind of instantly make something feel a little rigid, make your app feel a little too rigid. So just introducing circles where appropriate. It's not kind of like a universal thing, just throw circles at stuff and see what happens. It may help kind of introduce a little bit of softness or warmth.
Kind of makes sense for the Google Plus stream as well, because the Google Plus app also uses these circles for the avatars.
Exactly. Another one of my favorites is some tweaks we did to search. So if we press the search button here, you'll notice that you have common keywords, and this is something that in the future we may want to tweak to recent searches. But here are common keywords that you can search for, search across the session corpus on. And we added this query refinement, which is actually really easy for developers. You simply just add a single flag, and pressing this button basically populates the search field with that. So you can start with that search and then edit it as you see fit. And then the last thing I wanted to mention on the home screen personally was so the view pager margins. So as we switch between different tabs, you'll notice that the margins, there's about a 16-bit margin there, and they actually use a somewhat beveling effect. Very, very subtle. It's not like a very heavy drop shadow, but this beveling effect, first of all, I mean, it introduces more consistency when you look at the tablet app. Each of these, I don't want to call them cards, but each of these panes of content is actually slightly raised on its bevel. And it helps kind of communicate that these are the same thing if you have a phone and a tablet. Just on a phone, it's just kind of helping to further add a little bit of dimensionality without going too deep into skeuomorphism or anything like that. So
I think by default there's no
right.
There's no margin between them. So adding something there is something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. So and then actually on a tablet we talked about that. Yeah, I think that was all that I wanted to mention about the home screen. Anything else you wanted to mention, Adam, before you move on?
Are we covering the stream later or no?
Feel free to talk about it if you want.
I mean, compared to the 2012 app, we kind of, Roman actually redesigned the sort of way that the stream looks here. And so avatars around, and then there's sort of this like area for content if there's images available for those posts or reposts, reshares. There's sort of this transparent overlay that shows for certain types of post content. So you can see here there's this sort of like little overlay image to indicate that that there's an image being shared here. In this case it's a video, so there's a little video overlay. And
we actually use the center crop technique there. So whatever size, whatever width the stream is, I think we fixed the height. And generally this is not something you want to do on tablets if you have like really wide stream items. But using a center crop technique to make sure that each of these photos or media items, media overlays are a fixed size, but the content, which can be various aspect ratios, stays within that. I think we talked about that last time.
Yeah, and then two other minor points. One, as the images load, there's a very subtle sort of animation as they sort of snap in. And the other thing I wanted to mention is this fragment is it's very responsive. You'll see it used in many locations in the app. And so, in this case, it's sort of the same width, approximately the same width on both tablet and phone. But in other cases, it may take up a bigger portion of the screen, but it scales nicely depending on the amount of width that's available to it.
Yep. All right, let's jump into a track detail. So let's jump into the Android track here on both screens. I really love this demo setup.
Well, once it's finally working.
Yeah, hopefully next time it'll be less quirky in the beginning. But okay, so a couple things in the for the I guess session or track detail as we call this. So the first is you'll notice that there are very similar navigational elements. First, on a tablet we do have 2-pane UI, and a phone we have a single pane UI. On a phone you actually have tabs to let you switch between the different I guess parts or different items within a track. On a tablet, or on a phone you have that. On a tablet you have a spinner at the top that lets you kind of switch between this. So if I go from sessions to office hours, it'll just switch between that, and sandbox, for example. One of the nice things that we wanted to mention was that you do have contextual action bar support here. So you can even select one item, right? So view one session, and then long press to select other items, and then take action on those. Actually, in this case, there's no actions I could take because this one is in my schedule. But if I only select things that are not in my schedule, I can instantly add those all to my schedule all at once. So we also wanted to mention that the track icons, again, like track icons is one of the things that we added this year. We made sure that every track had some sort of visual identifier to kind of help differentiate it from other tracks. So we use those track icons in a lot of places. On a tablet, we use them in the header here. So if I switch to, say, the Google Plus track, you notice that the header actually changes the icon to Google Plus. Let's see what else we have. So another minor point is every UI element that is interactive has touch feedback. So if I put my finger on here, if I just press down on here, you'll notice that there's that blue overlay that covers it, that indicates that something is happening. Also, the same would work if you use a keyboard or something to focus that area. Another minor point is that on a tablet, the spinner and the I guess this track spinner, as well as the session detail heading, they have the same height, and that's kind of it's not really there's no interactional reason for it. It's just kind of a visual way to align things. I don't want to talk about which principle that is, because I probably don't know, but definitely it's one way to ensure that there's visual balance across your UI, is to align things where possible. If there's no kind of natural point of alignment, it doesn't make sense to do that, but in this case we thought that it would make sense to align them. Let's see. Sliding pane. So one thing we can't demo here is the portrait mode, and we talked about this very briefly last week. But in portrait mode, if you were to hold this tablet in portrait, you would actually have a sliding pane layout. So this left pane would initially be invisible, but if you were to slide the detail section over to the right, you would kind of slide out that left pane. And this is one way to kind of reconcile having the smaller amount of width available on a 10-inch or 7-inch device in portrait, but making sure that that you still have access to the same contents to kind of maintain the functional parity across portrait and landscape. So again, a minor point, not something we can demo right now. And then we already talked about the track icons in the action bar. So anything else we should cover for just this section here? Those are some of my favorites. Oh, actually, we'll cover that in a bit.
Yeah, we can jump into session detail.
Yeah. So for the session details, this is one of my favorite parts. So one of the things that we did was we moved the Add to Schedule button from the action bar. So it used to be kind of this button over here that would add whatever you're currently looking at to the action bar. Rachel Garb from the Android user experience team actually said, it's not really a good place for a key fundamental action like that. Something that should really be immediately visible and really immediately kind of gain the user's attention, because most of the time they're going to be looking at sessions and they're going to be wanting to add them to their schedule. Another thing is that we actually had a help overlay. We had a dialog pop up that said, hey, press this plus button to add the session to your schedule, and that was just too indirect. So we wanted to make it a little more direct, and we basically moved that item from the action bar to an inline button here, this in schedule button. So one cool thing about this is that it sticks to the top. So since while you're viewing a session details, you at any point may want to actually decide that, hey, this is interesting enough, I want to add this to my schedule. So we decided to make it stick to the top so that as you make the decision, it's always there. The same goes for tablet, actually. It's a little less noticeable for tablet, but it's the same behavior. Another thing is that there's the subtle animation. This is actually only for Android 4.0 and higher. As soon as you add something to your schedule, there's a very subtle animation. The plus becomes a checkbox or a check mark, and it kind of animates in to say, hey, it has now been added. It's almost like a subtle reinforcement that the action is really taking place and it's now really in your schedule. Very, very subtle. On earlier versions of the platform, we simply just show and hide. There's just some very basic switching logic to do that. Let's see. So another thing was just reinforcing that that visual language of using circles throughout. Each of the avatars here, each of the speakers are circles, and if you notice when you press on them, they kind of desaturate. Again, very, very subtle touch. If you generally have fairly simple content, you don't really need it. In this case, for avatars, it's probably not really adding that much. But if you have photos, if you have large photos that may potentially clash with the overlay, you may want to do that. Let's see, what else?
I guess you'll see the diagonal lines here in the header again. And then also the section headers are kind of our sort of recommended pattern here. You've got the all caps in the small font with the underline.
Yeah, we could have used tabs, right? We could definitely have used tabs, and I think in previous versions of the app we did use tabs, but we've switched more to a single scrolling experience, where basically, rather than kind of doing a lot of navigation back and forth between content, you kind of slowly scroll down and really peruse what's there, what's available. So you go from session details to speakers, and then to more stuff like submit feedback.
And of course, each of these sections is sort of dynamic in its height. The description could vary, the number of speakers could vary, and these sort of more links at the bottom also are dynamic. There could be many of them or fewer of them depending on which session it is.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to mention on a tablet, I guess, is the consistent iconography. And this is, again, introducing some consistency in the visuals that you use in your app is just as important as following the visual design guidelines on Android, right? So you make sure that your app is internally consistent. One of the other ways in which we do that, outside of using the diagonal line visual element in the circles, is this kind of unification of presentation of sessions that are in your schedule. So first, you'll notice that there are these little ribbons, or I guess bookmarks, that have a little check mark in them, and these are sessions that are in my schedule. And the same is mirrored here on the right in that Add to Schedule button. If I look at a session that's not added, you'll see the kind of the inverse state of that, and pressing that immediately shows the little check mark there. So these kind of subtle things help reinforce or help create a unified visual language across your app. So let's see. Talked about that. One other thing was on session details. You'll notice that on tablets we use a larger font as well as Roboto Light for the text here. And that's partly because it's generally a little easier. First of all, it helps mitigate kind of long line lengths, long line measure disasters. But in this case, it really helps make the content feel more balanced. Since there's a lot of space here, and if this were any smaller, and if this were Roboto regular, it may kind of feel a little too dense. So using that really helps on tablets.
The line heights are taller as well, right?
Yeah, the line heights are ever so slightly taller. And we use the styles, the resources framework / styles for this. Let's see. So let's quickly look at submit feedback on the phone. So submit feedback is, let's say you've seen a session, and I can do that on tablet as well, but let's say you've seen a session and now you want to look at, or now you want to provide feedback. So this is actually a custom control that we wrote. It's very simple. It's based on a seek bar. There's some crazy 9 patches in there, but it's really just a fancy seek bar. But the idea is that you have this slider. It's a kind of a sliding scale for ratings, and we use the standard accent color. It's like we call it IO blue. We use the standard accent color rather than hollow blue in this case because we wanted to kind of introduce a little bit more kind of color consistency throughout. And then at the bottom, you'll notice that we actually use that same blue for the radio buttons as well as the text field. So the little underline in the text field is also the same color. And the way we did that was we actually used Android Hollow colors from Jerome Vanderlinden, I believe. And Android Hollow Colors basically lets you throw in your accent color, and it'll just generate the assets for you, so your designers don't have to sit and draw all out. So I think that was it for session feedback. Let's jump into the map, and I think we're at about 20 minutes now, so we should probably hurry up. But let's look at the map here. So here's the map, and it's using the new Maps, the Android Maps API v2. I forgot the name of that, but
yep.
It's using the new Android Maps API. And you'll notice that some of the interesting things here. First, each of these map markers is customized. So it's using that standard, blue, purple, red gradient inside there. Next is when you open up, let's say, the sandbox area, right? You'll notice that we use that same styling for showing icons. This is the same styling on a tablet where you'd see kind of the title at the top left, I guess some sort of subtitle below, and then the icon on the top right. And you use actually a subtle gradient as well to kind of hint that this is, I guess it's part of the visual language. There's no real meaning to it, I guess. Let's see, what else for this? Oh, so we actually use bold condensed here for the text. So for very long, what's a really long one? So develop for good, for example. For very long titles, bold, or I guess Roboto condensed helps compress that horizontally. So let's quickly look at the pop-up. So let's say I actually decide to look at what's in this room. So if I touch here, on a tablet, you see a separate pane pop up, and it's kind of a floating pane, whereas on a phone, you actually get a separate activity. Now, if on a tablet I decide to jump into one of these, I can touch in, and it will load it right here. And again, you see all that those same consistent buttons, like the Add to Schedule button, and so on. But you also get this breadcrumb at the top. So if I really quickly want to jump back to room 8, I can either press back, or I can just press this. And then I can obviously dismiss this as well. You notice that showing that pop-up actually automatically pans the map so that whatever was currently in the center remains at the visible center. OK, so that was the map. I think that was the map. Is there anything else we should talk about the live stream?
We can very quickly cover it.
Yeah. Well, I think we knew this was going to go long, so that's fine.
Just press that.
Yeah.
So this is the live stream activity, so you can watch any of the sessions that are being streamed live on YouTube. We just plugged in some of our own values here, so we've got ADIA inside ADIA. But we can't actually show this on the phone. But on the tablet here, on the left side, you'll sort of see one pane broken out, and on the right side, there's a split between tabs for the sort of social stream from Google Plus, and then captions. So some of the live streams actually had live captions as well. On a phone device, it'll just be collapsed into these sort of 3 tabs that fall below the video. And then I guess you can go full screen as well here. So this is the YouTube API for Android. So it sort of comes with all the sort of standard bells and whistles that you could sort of expect from the YouTube player. And we'll actually cover a little bit more on the sort of full screen modes shortly after this I/O app recap. That's pretty much it, right?
Well, we can show the full screen real quick, right?
Let's see if it works.
Yeah, it should work.
Okay.
And then you could toggle the controls. We'll actually talk about this in a moment with toggling controls. You notice that almost everything, the status bar, the navigation bar, and the action bar, all fade away, leaving just the content. And we'll talk about that actually in the deep dive for full screen UIs. All right. So really quickly, just to recap, there's a lot of cool things in this app. It'll be open sourced very soon. Well, hopefully very, very soon. We're just waiting on a couple of things to be sorted out before we can do that. And yeah, it's been a pleasure working on it. There are some things that we'd probably do differently, right?
Yeah. So actually at I/O there was an app clinic live, and one of the comments that Rito gave us is about the refresh button.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have this manual refresh button at the top, and when you're actually syncing content, it'll show a spinner in place. But one of the comments that Ian and Rado gave us was that, why do you need refresh? This should automatically sync in the background. Refresh should not be, primary action. It should be secondary, if anything, if at all. And we do actually have a Google Cloud messaging enabled here. So we do refresh, on push from the server. So we could probably just very simply just remove the refresh button or move it into the overflow. So definitely, if you have, especially if you have a sync adapter, if you have Google Cloud Messaging turned on, you don't necessarily need refresh. So you may remove that for next year.
Yeah, I think the one other purpose of the refresh button was to refresh the Google Plus stream. So we had some limitations there in terms of how we would fetch new content and actually display it inline there. But hopefully in a future version we can sort of get rid of that refresh button and just intelligently refresh as needed.
Yeah. All right, so that was a whopping demo of the I/O app. We probably have like 3 seconds for the rest of our content, but there's a lot of good content left. Let's see. So let's jump back into the slides. There they are. So that was the I/O app. Again, if you want to install it now just to play around with it, here's the QR code. But let's jump into sharing.
All right. So go through this very quickly, this shallow dive on sharing content. So I just want to talk about a few things. Sharing's something that's very system-wide, and so I think convention is very important when it comes to something like sharing. So hopefully whenever you sort of use a share action, you always use the native Android share icon. It's actually surprisingly something we see done incorrectly many times, so definitely do that. Also avoid hard coding to specific apps or services. So there may be a specific use case where it's sort of useful to do that, but for the vast majority of cases, you should really be calling out to the system share intent, which I'll show you some examples of that in just a second, rather than sort of hard coding to fire up a specific app or a specific service that receives sharing. I think Android users have just become really, really used to being able to use whichever application or service they want to use. And so when they don't get that, they're just going to be unhappy, and it's going to be a frustrating experience.
One other thing I wanted to note is that sometimes you want to do a really rich integration with a certain network like Twitter or Facebook. That's okay too, but if you do decide to do that, then make sure that you have an equally prominent, at least kind of equally prominent, equally
obvious,
visible, option to share with other things on the platform. So if you want to do like a rich integration, that's fine, but make sure to also offer this as a viable, as a visible alternative.
Yeah, and then lastly, share goes very, very well as an action bar action or as an action provider, which is something I'll talk about in just a second as well. Alternatively, if it's not sort of a primary action for your particular activity, you can go into the overflow. It's also fine to put it inline. That's a valid option as well. I think just a lot of the time it does suit the action bar very well, though. If it's primary, it goes straight there in a visible action. If not, it can fall into the overflow. So let me quickly, very quickly talk through the sort of 2 main ways that the sharing action goes into the action bar. So first of all, there's the share action provider. So it's kind of hard to see here. Let's zoom in a little bit. This is sort of how it looks. It's going to be kind of hard to see on the video, but you'll sort of see this very thin outline with the share icon, a little arrow in the bottom right corner, and then right next to that is sort of your most recently used or most frequently used application that you've used to share in this particular application before. So tapping on that share icon actually brings down this menu which shows 3 additional share options. This is ordered by frequency of use, and then if you tap See All, it'll sort of expand out to show you the rest. The really nice thing about the share action provider is it's not going to throw up this sort of big dialogue. It sort of feels like you're still within your application, and it also bubbles up any of the applications that you're using to share and orders by frequency. So it sort of does all these things for you while sort of still letting you feel like you're inside the application. And then just sort of down the bottom here, you'll see for developers to sort of implement this, a quick tip is to use sharecompat.configure menu item. It sort of does all these things for you in a backward compatible manner.
Sweet.
And then the other option is just to have it as a regular share action. So rather than a action provider, it's just a standard action item that goes in the action bar there. So here you should just use the standard icon like I discussed. And then call out to the sort of standard system share intent, which is action send. And that will fire up this system dialog, which goes on top of your application here. And this is what the sort of more recent version of it looks like on, I think, Jelly Bean Plus. The nice thing about this is that it's being called by the system, so you get this sort of consistent feel across all applications that are creating this dialog. It also is optimized for larger screens, so when it shows on a, say, a 10-inch tablet, it's going to go into well, it's already multi-column. It's going to go into probably 3 columns.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that you can add items to this, so you can prepend intents to show at the top here. So by default, it'll just show whatever can respond to the send intent, but you can obviously add things at the top. So like I think it was Pocket, or there's some app out there that actually introduced a copy to clipboard, where basically you can share directly to the clipboard to get that URL and paste it wherever else you want.
Yep, and the nice thing about this dialog is that it may vary with OS version, or maybe we'll change it in a future OS version. But as long as you call this intent, you'll get the sort of standard system behavior there. And then just down the bottom again for developers, sort of implement this intent, use share_compat.intentBuilder. And then last quick point, you can go completely custom. These are all available programmatically to fetch what applications can receive a share intent. Generally, it's not recommended unless you want to do something particularly different. So there's no slide for that here, but just something to keep in mind. All right, let's keep on moving.
Let's keep on rolling to full screen UIs. So this is basically talking about how you deal with system bars, like the status bar and navigation bar, where your content is supposed to be immersive, like for example photos, videos, or books or things like that as you're reading. So very quickly, just a couple of definitions. You have the status bar, which contains notifications as well as time and date, well not date, but time as well as battery level, Wi-Fi, cell signal, things like that. That's the status bar, just for terminology. The navigation bar is the bar at the bottom that contains back, home, and recents. On earlier versions of the platform, you don't actually have a navigation bar because you have, I guess, soft keys. I never know if you should call them soft keys or hard keys. You have keys that are built into the device for that. So the navigation bar is something that appears on newer devices that don't have any sort of keys on the front. And just in terms of sizes, for designers, obviously you care about the size of these things. They can vary from device to device. There's no single standard. And this kind of fits in with don't design for 1 pixel resolution. But in case you are interested, roughly and in general, the status bar is about 25 dips tall, and the navigation bar is roughly about 48 dips. I think on phones in landscape, it's actually a lot smaller, like 40 dips. But and again, don't rely on these numbers. These are numbers that will probably change in the future, and they probably change on different devices. On earlier versions of the platform, there was this kind of combined bar that combined both the status bar and the navigation elements. And this is also generally 48 dips tall. But this is more deprecated. So if you see screenshots, especially with this, they're using the older system UI style. So make sure that you plan for both, because if you're supporting, for example, Android 4.0. Actually, it was 4.0. Yeah, 4.0 was using this. If you're supporting Android 4.0 and higher, just be aware that your buttons may be, your notifications may actually be in the bottom right at some point. Okay, so there are lots of different full screen modes, and this slide is littered with stuff. But you basically have a couple of modes. You have normal mode, where everything is visible. You have low profile mode, where the bars are visible, and actually you can selectively you can mix and match what happens to the status bar and the navigation bar. But the low profile mode still shows the bars, but it recedes them visually. So you'll notice that the status bar here is dimmed. You actually don't even see the notification icon. You see just a little dot indicating that there's something there. And then your back, home, and recents are also visually recessed. So they're also kind of little dots, just hinting to the user that, hey, there's something here. It's not completely non-interactive, but touch here to find out. And then a couple of points. Generally, when you use this kind of UI, something that works really well is overlaying the action bar. So here, this is actually the action bar with a semi-transparency applied. Another important point is when you touch on the content, you should always toggle, right? So you should never permanently be in low profile mode or this other mode, which we'll talk about. So touching should actually be the action that toggles things. And actually in this low profile mode, you obviously also want to hide other UI elements as well as the action bar. That's actually one thing I should mention right after this. So there's another mode called hide navigation. And hide navigation hides the navigation bar at the bottom, and it's usually tied. It usually also hides the top bar, the status bar. So in this case, you have full control over the pixels on the screen. So basically, your app is drawing everything to the screen, and this works really well for videos, for video content. And one caveat here is that this isn't permanent. As soon as the user touches the screen, the system will automatically show the navigation again, because you don't want to lock the user into a place where they have no access to back home and recents. That's just really, really bad. So there's one thing I wanted to mention, and oh right, the last thing I wanted to mention about these different modes is you generally want to only switch between two, normal and low profile, or normal and hide navigation. And you don't want to have different UI elements on the screen going on and off at different times. You actually want to make sure that you either have the status bar, the navigation bar, the action bar, and other UI controls all visible, like here, or none of them visible. So basically, this boils down to make sure that the action bar visibility is tied to the visibility of the other elements on the screen.
The way I like to think about these two is that low profile is sort of for an immersive activity where there may still be some user interaction, like maybe you're swiping through photos, maybe you're reading a book or something like that. Whereas the hide navigation is more useful for something where you're not sort of interacting with it, like watching a video, you're just sitting back and looking at the screen.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so those are the different modes. Just a couple of examples on apps that do this, in our opinion, really well. First is Google Play Books. So, by default, you see this, your actual book itself, as well as some controls at the bottom and the action bar at the top. But as soon as you touch, well, actually not here, as soon as you touch the screen, the action bar, the status bar, and the UI control at the bottom, the scrubber, they all fade out, and then the navigation bar goes into low profile mode. So what you end up seeing is just nothing but content, nothing but the body of the book itself. And then there are some actions here for back home and recents, obviously. Those should be visible. Another nice thing that this does is that the content doesn't jump. So if I touch to toggle, the content doesn't kind of realign, stuff or relay itself out. And this is possible on Jelly Bean. So in Jelly Bean, we introduced some new APIs to make sure that this is possible. On earlier versions, it's much harder to do that if you're showing and hiding certain things, like the navigation bar especially. Another app that does this really well is Pocket. So they're also kind of like a reading app. But one thing that they do slightly differently is they actually toggle, they also toggle on touch, but they also hide the system UI as you start scrolling. So as you start scrolling down, it goes into low profile mode. It still shows the status bar, which is good because if you have an email come in, you want to be aware that something is happening. And also, it shows low profile mode for the navigation bar. So it's really, really subtle, but it's very nice to kind of focus, to let the user really focus on the content itself. And lastly, we have YouTube. So YouTube is kind of the canonical example of a great video playing application. And obviously what YouTube does is they hide everything possible when you go into this full screen mode. So this is, again, possible with the new Jelly Bean APIs. Yeah, and one thing to note is that in the new Jelly Bean APIs, one of the caveats or consequences is that the navigation bar can actually overlay your content. So you notice here that the navigation bar is actually cutting off the content. So if you have something really important at the bottom, or I guess in this case at the right of your screen, you want to make sure that you're not necessarily using that flag. You probably just want to use low profile.
Yeah, and the IO app uses the YouTube Player API, so it gets a lot of these things for free. It handles all of the full screen modes for you. Yeah. And then one quick developer tip, I don't know how, are we really far over?
That's fine.
is if you go to Eclipse, and I think IntelliJ or Android Studio shortly, you can create a full screen activity.
Yep.
Which kind of implements a pretty large chunk of this behavior for you, at least for photo viewing or sort of full screen viewing activity here.
I was actually playing with it yesterday. I think there's a bug in it. I'll have to fix it. But
okay, don't use it yet then.
Yeah, there's definitely it's a great starting point.
Yeah.
It'll get you most of the way there for almost all platform versions, I think. Yeah, all right, so we're going to fly through design news. So I think we're at about 40 minutes. This is obviously a very long episode. Let's just quickly fly through some design news. First, I don't know how to pronounce their name. I love these guys. I think it's Apollo or...
We think it's Apollo, right? Mike, you can tell us later.
Yeah, Opolu or Apollo. Mike on the Apollo team actually created this, or wrote up this blog post called the Holy Grail, question mark, Android design guidelines, a realistic approach. And it's a really kind of good perspective on how do you treat the guidelines. Do you treat them as rules? Do you treat them as visual guidelines? Or how can you deviate from them, and in which cases should you? It's not full on in depth. It's not comprehensive, but it's a kind of a nice perspective on it. Basically, one of the anecdotes that he had was that in one of their apps, Timer, they introduced a dark theme that used an orange accent color, and a bunch of users were like, "Oh, this isn't hollow. This isn't hollow," because it was orange and not blue. And that's absolutely not true. I mean, it could still be in line with the guidelines if you use your brand's accent colors. So definitely, don't feel like the guidelines are the end-all, be-all of design. Next, Taylor Ling, who's been on here a million times, has created kind of a UI design, UI wireframing kit for Google Slides, for Google Docs. And he also updated his Photoshop version. So if you're interested in wireframing, kind of high-fidelity prototyping, well, not really prototyping, high-fidelity wireframe stuff, check this out for sure.
Taylor Ling again?
Yeah, so Taylor issued very similar to the Android Design in Action live lab that we ran at I/O. Taylor issued a redesign challenge on his blog. If you're interested in participating, I think he's giving away Google Play gift cards as prizes. So definitely, feel free to check it out. And I think this is not the one. No, there's one more. You want to talk about Gmail?
Yeah, so a Gmail update went live in play, I think, yesterday or maybe the day before. There's a few new sort of design patterns in there worth checking out. First of all is the navigation drawer. The official navigation drawer pattern there is implemented in the new Gmail app. So we didn't have the official screenshots of the drawer out here, but you can see there it's got the drawer affordance in the top left, and of course hitting that brings out the drawer. Edge swipe brings out the drawer.
And this replaced the action bar spinner that was there before.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the refresh UI.
Yeah, so the new Gmail app also has kind of a new take on a swipe down to refresh type of UI that's been very popular in other apps. It's not done using kind of like an elastic band type thing. It's done using kind of this other type of visuals. We don't have it here, but it's pretty interesting. If you want to check it out, by all means. One thing we'll say is that this is not an official guideline or anything. This is just one exploration of how refresh can be done. Until something gets published, and we're not sure if this will be published in the guidelines, but until something gets published, I wouldn't rush to kind of implement this in your own apps unless you just really want to for some reason. But yeah, refresh. Our current best practices for refresh are either automatic refresh, not even giving the user the option or the need to refresh, or something in the action overflow or action bar.
It is a very nice hollow take on this sort of swipe to refresh.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
Very cool.
And I think this is, that was the last one. Okay. So the last is this new website called screensize.es, screen sizes. It's this really nice, really quick reference to common devices as well as their screen sizes and densities. So if you're really quickly trying to, do some, back of the napkin calculation on dips or something like that, you can hop over to this website that has a list of common devices. Also, it's mobile friendly, so if you pop it open on your Android device, it'll look great. And I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oof, what a doozy. Yeah. So I think we promised a doozy, and I think we delivered a very long show. Sorry for going way, way over, but it's been a pleasure. As always, I'm Roman Nurik.
See you later, guys. Adam Koch here.
See you next week.
Bye.